Hello, my favorite carboholics. This is Henry with Henry's Bread Kitchen and baking great bread at home. Now that's a pretty loaf, isn't it? Yeah, that was done at home. So today I'm going to make a sourdough loaf, and you can follow along with me. I've got a starter here that I started about 4 days ago, and she is not as strong as I'd like her to be at all. So we've got a few more days to go to work on that. This one I started a few days earlier than that, and it's stronger. I stirred it down a little bit earlier, so it's not as easy to recognize, but it's not mature. So as a result, I'm going to treat it a little differently in this recipe. I'm going to add 320 milliliters of water, which is going to make this dough about a 65% hydration. And then I'm going to add all of the sourdough starter that's called for in the recipe, which is about 100 grams, which is going to be a 20% inoculation here. Because I'm not going to add it directly to the dough after the autolyse as typical in a sourdough bread, I'm going to add it to the water and get it completely mixed up and then add the heavier flour with it. I'm going to put 50 grams of water in there and 50 grams of flour, and that'll go back in the refrigerator and it'll be my starter for the next time. So get the starter well mixed into your water. This is the same kind of thing that would happen if you were to refresh it in the jar. And once it's completely combined, I'm going to add my heavier grains, like my whole grain. And it takes longer. The reason for the autolyse is it takes a little longer for water to penetrate the germ and the bran in a whole wheat flour. So this autolyse will do a number of things. It'll make the crumb much lighter, and it's just going to make for a much better gluten development as we move forward. So we're adding our flour here, our whole wheat flour. We'll mix that up, and then we're going to let it sit for 30 minutes to 45 minutes to absorb as much water as it possibly can before we start making the dough. Because if you had a drier dough, it's not going to perform the same way as if if it was wet. Plus, this gives the sourdough starter a refresher, and it starts to behave like it's been refreshed. Here's what it looks like after 45 minutes, and you can see the difference. You can see the bubbles in there, how active this is. Now I'm going to go ahead and add all of the white flour that's called for in the recipe. Typically, I would use bread flour here, and I'm using a King Arthur brand, but I don't have any bread flour. So I'm going to use a King Arthur all-purpose flour. Here you want the higher protein content that you would get from bread flour, which is about 14%. But with this, with King Arthur all-purpose flour, I know I'm getting about 12%, which is strong enough to bake bread with. So what we're doing is not trying to develop any gluten. We're trying, in this stage, we're not trying to develop gluten at all. We're trying to make sure that all of the flour in our recipe is hydrated. We don't want any loose flour on the walls or on the floor of this container at all. So, and on the skin of it. So you make sure you've got all the flour, and then we're going to mix it really well so that there's no loose flour on the surface, like I'm doing here. All my flour has been picked up. I'm just making sure that the surface is as hydrated as the inside. And we're not going to develop gluten right here. Now we're going to close her up and prepare for the first stretch and fold after about 45 minutes. Well, it's been 45 minutes, and you can see the difference in the dough, and you can see how extensible it is. Look at that. So I will stretch and fold one time from each corner of the compass, and this is what's asking the molecules to line up and become stronger, and the gluten will become more active, and it can strengthen the dough so that our little CO2 can be held in as opposed to escaping. Now I'm going to do something different here. Rather than a stretch and fold, I'm going to do a lamination, where we spread the dough out nice and thin. This is also helping to line up those the protein, the gluten in your bread. And then where you want to make sure that you're reaching all the way in and getting your dough from all the way inside and not just stretching from the edges. And we're going to fold it just like we fold up a little letter and flip it over, and we're going to put it back in the container it was in. And now it's going to be time for a 12-hour bulk fermentation. So we close it up, it goes in the refrigerator, and we'll see you 12 hours later. Well, it's been 12 hours, and look at here. You can see the bubbles on top. The fermentation has done its job, and now it's time to shape it. If I had more than one loaf in this recipe, it would be time to divide it. So let's pull it out, shape it a little bit. This is going to be our pre-shape. Give it some structure, and then we will final shape it after it's rested this way for a while. This is a little stitching that I like to do sometimes on my pre-shapes. And then we're going to let them sit before, 10 minutes before we final shape it. So since I'm using all-purpose flour in here, if I use all-purpose flour to line my banneton, then I take a big chance on having, and because it's a wet dough, of having it stick. And if it sticks in your banneton, that's a bad day. You don't want to do that. Not after all this work, and have it come apart at the end is not what you want. So I'm using some rice flour or semolina flour in the banneton and on the surface of my dough. I'm tightening up the edges, giving it a little bit more tension, and then it goes into the refrigerator for the last cold proof, and I'm preheating my oven to 500 degrees. This is that same starter, has not moved since yesterday. We'll put it away and take a look at the one that I refreshed after we made the dough yesterday, and look at it. Look at that. That's amazing. 2 different starters in my kitchen are behaving this differently, which tells you, you just have to do it and see what happens when you do it. Now, I'm going to be using a tool that we use in sourdough and in baking called a loam. But first, before I tell you about that, this is not the same dough. This is another dough that I had in the refrigerator, and I pulled it out, and as I was pulling it out, I dropped it, and I caught it. I caught it with my hand in the dough. So God only knows what this is going to look like and how it's going to turn out, because I had to kind of put it back together. But that's not bad. It doesn't look bad at all. So I'll score this and put it in the oven and see how we turn out. Now, I'm going to use a loam to score it, and I have 3 different kinds here. I just want to show you so you know what's on the market. That was the first one I've ever used, and I love it. This one is a very nice loam, and I love the weight. I love the way it feels in my hand. And this was a gift a few weeks ago that I got from someone, and it has a little bit more of a 45-degree angle at the tip. I just wish it were a little heavier. That's all. Now, the most important thing about any loam you get is the razor. If you've scored bread, or if you've scored 3 or 4 loaves of bread, it's time to change your razor. To flip it around at least so that you have a fresh side, because it really makes a difference in how it behaves when you score your bread. It's still sharp, but you need it sharp. You need it really, really sharp. So let's see, what do we do with this? I think I'm just going to score the side and then make a big cut down the middle. That's an easy thing to do. That's an easy decoration to make. And here I am. I just want to get about 1/4 of an inch underneath. And because I'm using parchment paper, it's going to make it really easy for me to pick it up and drop it right into my cast iron Dutch oven. So this is how it turned out. Beautiful loaf. Absolutely beautiful crumb. You can tell that it's really crispy on the outside, so you've got a nice crunch. And that's the way we do it. It works. Have a good day.